You already know the story of Joseph. The favorite son, the coat, the pit, sold, imprisoned. Then he had run against everything, the rise, the forgiveness, the reunion. But the question no one asks is, how? How does a man with no name in this country, no citizenship, no connections, no rights inside the most powerful empire on earth, become the second most powerful person in that empire? And when we say the most powerful empire on earth, we mean that literally. Egypt in this period controlled the Nile, the longest river in the world, and with it, the only reliable agricultural surplus in the entire ancient Near East. Every civilization around it, Canaan, Mesopotamia, Libya, depended on Egyptian grain when their own harvest failed. Egypt didn't just have wealth, it had the thing everyone else needed to survive. That kind of power doesn't just make you rich, it makes you the center of the world. 13 years is how long it actually took. And when you look closely at those 13 years, at the world he was dropped into, at every decision he made, every person he watched, this stops being just a forgiveness story. It becomes something else. A story about what it takes to become what the world needs. Inside a world that gave you every reason to disappear. To understand how that happened, you have to understand where he landed. Egypt around 1700 BC was not the Egypt of the Great Pyramid builders. That era was over. This was a period of political fracture, what historians call the Second Intermediate Period. A Semitic-speaking people from Canaan, the Hyksos, were migrating into the Nile Delta and consolidating control over Lower Egypt. They brought with them new military technology, the horse-drawn chariot, the composite bow, bronze weapons Egypt had never seen. They didn't conquer Egypt by force alone. They outpaced it. And as they rose, Semitic names began appearing in Egyptian administrative records, in positions of real authority, in the very system Joseph was about to enter. A Hebrew from Canaan entering this world was not walking through a door completely closed to him. He was arriving at the one historical window, perhaps the only one in centuries, where what he was didn't automatically end the story before it began. But first, he had to survive all of it. Before Joseph ever set foot in Egypt, he had already been assigned a price. 20 pieces of silver. That was what his brothers agreed on. The commercial records document it clearly. Clay tablets excavated from Nutsi in northern Mesopotamia show the going rate for a male slave between 5 and 20 years old was 20 to 30 shekels. Joseph was 17. His brothers didn't undervalue him or overpay. They sold him at market rate, the way you'd sell livestock or grain. But before the pit, there was the coat. In Hebrew, the garment Jacob gave Joseph is called a ketonet pasim. It's usually translated as a coat of many colors, which misses the weight of it. The same phrase appears only one other time in the Hebrew Bible, in the book of Samuel, describing the robes worn by the virgin daughters of the king. Jacob wasn't giving his son a pretty gift. He was dressing him in the clothing of an heir, in front of brothers old enough to understand exactly what that meant. They weren't jealous because their father loved Joseph more. They were threatened because their father had just publicly declared that Joseph would lead them, and they had no intention of allowing that. The pit at Dothan was not an impulsive act. It was the conclusion of a power struggle that had been building for years. Dothan itself sat at a critical junction, the point where the Jezreel Valley opened onto the coastal trade highway connecting Canaan to Egypt. The Ishmaelite caravan that passed through was not a coincidence. They traveled fixed commercial routes, moving goods south toward the Nile Delta. When Joseph's brothers saw them, they didn't have to wait long to form a plan. There is a detail in Genesis that most people read past without stopping. After throwing Joseph into the pit, his brothers sat down to eat. They sat down for a meal. Right there, while he was still calling out from below, something they themselves admitted years later. The Hebrew word used for that pit is bor, a cistern, a dry well, a place with no water and no way out. The same word appears again later in the story when Joseph describes the prison cell he's been held in. One word carrying the same weight across two different captivities. The language doesn't do that by accident. Joseph left Canaan not as someone cast into nothing, but as someone placed into an active commercial network, a system designed to move goods and people from Canaan down to the Nile Delta. He arrived in Egypt as a purchased asset, but he was watching everything on the way down. Potiphar's house was not a random stop. Potiphar was the captain of Pharaoh's guard, the man responsible for royal security, and the man who controlled the royal prison. This was not a minor official. He operated inside the innermost circle of Egyptian power, and Joseph was sold directly into that household. What happened next became a pattern. Joseph didn't wait for something to change. He worked. He watched how the system functioned, how assets were managed, how the household was organized, how decisions moved through the chain, and he made himself indispensable. Genesis records that Potiphar handed Joseph oversight of everything he owned. Not part of it, all of it. A powerful man surrendering his keys to a foreign slave, because that slave had demonstrated that everything he touched ran better. Then Potiphar's wife accused him. What most people don't pause on is this. Potiphar sent Joseph to prison, not to execution. For a slave accused of assaulting his master's wife, the standard outcome was death. But Potiphar was the official who controlled the royal prison. He knew his own household. And the prison he sent Joseph into was not a common jail. It was the facility where Pharaoh's own officials were held. Joseph was still inside the system. The pattern repeated. Managing, observing, reading the system from inside. And he met two men, Pharaoh's chief cupbearer and his chief baker. In the Egyptian court, the cupbearer was not a servant in any ordinary sense. He tasted the king's wine before it reached the king's lips. The last line of defense against poisoning. This was a man with direct, trusted access to Pharaoh. Joseph recognized what that meant the moment he saw him. He interpreted both dreams without hesitation. The cupbearer would be restored. The baker would be executed. He told them both plainly, within the same conversation. 3 days later, everything happened exactly as he said. Before the cupbearer left, Joseph made one request. Not a plea, a simple statement of fact. I was taken from my homeland. I did nothing to deserve this place. Mentioned my name to Pharaoh. The cupbearer walked back into the palace and forgot Joseph for 2 years. He sat in the royal prison, a man who had just proven exactly what he could do, who had bet on the right person, and that person walked back into the light and left him in the dark. This is the point where most people break. Then Pharaoh dreamed. 7 fat cows devoured by 7 gaunt ones. 7 full heads of grain consumed by 7 withered ones. He woke unsettled in a way he couldn't name. And when he summoned every dream interpreter in the palace, not one of them could offer an answer that satisfied him. This was a crisis. The ruler of the most powerful empire on earth was standing before a dream his entire apparatus could not read, which meant the empire had no idea what was coming. When the cupbearer finally remembered the name from the prison, he wasn't recommending a curiosity. He was offering Pharaoh a last option. Before Joseph entered Pharaoh's presence, he shaved and changed his clothes. This was not a minor detail. Hebrews wore beards. It was part of their cultural and religious identity. Egyptians did not. Court officials shaved everything. Head, face, a requirement of ritual purity before entering the space of a man considered divine. Before Joseph spoke a single word, he had already erased the most visible marker of what he was. He knew exactly what this room required of him. And dream interpretation in Egypt was not folk tradition. It was official religious infrastructure. Pharaoh's interpreters were priests, trained in temples, paid by the state. When they failed to read his dream, it wasn't an intellectual failure. It was a sign that the gods were withholding something. The entire religious apparatus of the empire had gone silent on the one question Pharaoh needed answered. Pharaoh told the dream. Joseph listened. 7 years of abundance, followed by 7 years of famine so severe, the years of plenty would be erased from memory entirely. The dream came twice because the matter was fixed, and it would happen soon. At that point, a dream interpreter's job was done. Joseph kept talking. Nobody asked him to. He was a prisoner pulled from a cell to explain a dream. His role, technically, was finished. But he continued, and what he said next is the reason he got the position. He proposed a national economic policy. What the empire needed was someone with full authority to collect 1/5 of all grain production across the 7 good years, build centralized storage across every province, and control distribution when the famine hit. Without that system, the empire would not survive year 3. He had thought about this before he walked into the room. 13 years inside the Egyptian system had taught him how grain was recorded, how assets moved through administrative chains, How decisions escalated through ranks. Potiphar's house was the first school. The royal prison was the second. He wasn't interpreting a dream. He was presenting a plan he already had the competence to execute. Pharaoh looked at the advisors around him and said, "Can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God?" In Egyptian theology, Pharaoh was the intermediary between the gods and humanity, the only figure permitted to communicate with the divine. When he recognized the presence of God in Joseph, that was not a compliment. It was political and religious legitimization in a single sentence. No one in that court could object after those words. He gave Joseph his signet ring, the seal whose mark on any decree carried the force of Pharaoh's own command. Fine linen, shesh, the fabric worn only by priests and royalty, a gold chain, and the title Chadi, vizier, the man who ran the entire administrative apparatus of the empire. Joseph was placed in the royal chariot and rode through the streets while crowds called out, "Abrek," bow the knee before him. This was not ceremony. It was a public transfer of authority, witnessed by the population of Egypt. Pharaoh gave him a new name, Zaphanath-Paneah. In ancient Egyptian, it means the one who provides the sustenance of the land, not named for his origins, not for his story, named for his function. This is what the empire needs, and from this point forward, that is who you are. He also gave Joseph a wife, Asenath, daughter of the priest of On, the center of sun worship in Egypt, the most powerful religious institution in the empire. The marriage was not a reward, it was integration. Joseph was now bound into the priestly class at the highest level. He was no longer an outsider in any meaningful sense. Joseph was 30 years old, 13 years after his brothers threw him into a pit at Dothan. Second year of the famine, morning, the grain distribution hall. 10 men from Canaan walked in and bowed their faces to the ground before the vizier. He recognized them the moment they walked in, said nothing. He accused them of being spies, had them held for 3 days. He was testing, not out of cruelty, but because that's what he had been doing for all those years, watching, reading people, waiting until he knew exactly what he was standing in front of. He wanted to know if they had changed, so he constructed a situation, almost identical to the one at Dothan. This time, they could sacrifice Benjamin, the youngest, the new favorite, to save themselves. The same choice they had made with him 20 years before. They didn't. Judah, the one who had proposed selling Joseph that day, stepped forward and offered to die in Benjamin's place. Only then did Joseph say who he was, and he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it from outside the room. Now look at what his plan actually did to Egypt. Joseph's grain policy didn't just save lives, it restructured an entire society. During the famine years, the Egyptian people traded their livestock for grain. When the livestock ran out, they sold their land. When the land was gone, they sold themselves. By the time the famine ended, nearly all the land in Egypt, except the land held by priests, belonged to Pharaoh. A society of independent farmers had become a nation of tenant laborers working the king's soil. His policy saved millions of lives, and in doing so, concentrated power in Pharaoh's hands at a scale Egypt had never seen. People from across the ancient world came, those living along the Tigris and Euphrates, the two rivers that had nourished the first civilizations on earth, came to Egypt asking for food. The greatest rivers in the world were not enough. Only the Nile and the granaries Joseph had built along it had anything left to give. Jacob's family settled in Goshen, the most fertile region of the Nile Delta. They arrived as 70 people. They would stay for 400 years, and from those 70, a nation would be born. All of it began with an empty cistern at Dothan. In Genesis 50, Joseph told his brothers, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good." That's usually read as comfort. It's also a historical observation. Without the betrayal, no Egypt. Without Egypt, no nation. Without the nation, none of what came after. Grace doesn't fall on someone passive. It meets someone who kept preparing, even when there was no reason to. When you read Joseph's story again after this, you'll see it differently. Not fewer miracles, more. Because the real miracle wasn't the moment he was lifted up. It was the 13 years before it, and the man he chose to become inside them. The grain hall, 10 brothers with their faces to the ground, and Joseph, still seated, still watching, the way he had been watching for 13 years, waiting until he was certain that what he was seeing was real. Which part of Joseph's story lands differently for you now? The pit, the prison, or the moment he finally said his name?